A band of primitives completes its domestic obligations and gazes longingly upon its surroundings, amply befoliaged as it is, though with clearings upon which to erect a series of huts as well as lean-tos at forest's edge. The members of the band are wishing there might be recreational activities to engage in as their daily energies wane. But why are we whispering? Unable to muster the requisite inspiration, one intrepid band member seeks the assistance of a black monolith. A shorter version of that much later to appear in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, though the reference would have been completely lost on them. And despite the anticipation on the part of those filmmakers that the moon would already have been colonized by that date. The larger versions consider the shorter to be the runt of the litter and refer to it as mini-us. Reticent to approach the dwarf-like 1x4x9 handbreadth entity in what could be regarded as an unworthy manner, one bold primitive marshals the nerve not only to draw near but also to touch it, thereby producing what could only be described, had they the wherewithal to do so, as an electric shock, which enabled him to hit upon the idea of an athletic group pastime. This seed thought began to germinate in, what should he call it, the neuroanatomy housed in his cranium? Yeah, that's it. He is all aflutter with devising the rules of the game, which of course must be abided by should the event commence and continue in an orderly fashion, for one mustn't simply participate in a contest willy-nilly or, heaven forbid, higgledy-piggledy, as that would produce the merely chaotic. No, there must be a proper conforming to a standard of conduct, which makes him cogitate, perhaps in my spare time I should apply a similar code to acts outside of avocations in general, but then again, nah, who's got the time? Days afterward, he is ready to present the concept to the head member of the group, arriving as he did with the object of play, not knowing how well it would be received. He gestures to the leader, known respectfully as Gronk number 1, with his hands, the group being at the pre-linguistic stage, but at the same time masters at charades, as to how this object originated and could be utilized. This highest-ranking band member, for one did not want to usurp the official pecking order, points to the object of play with a resounding, huh? When presented with it, as if to ask, from whence came this sorcery? The subordinate band member, understood as Gronk number 2, employing the middle and index fingers, not as yet having come to symbolize peace, motioned in a response to a nearby deer and then to the region of his own midsection, technically known as the belly button, whereupon the higher-ranking member rubbed his tummy, excuse the jargon, and licked his lips, uttering, as if to acknowledge, "Ye fine sir, I concur, the musculature when served smoked with herbs is most pleasant to the palate." To which the other waves his hands, palms outwards, from side to side, shakes his head and utters, not a sophisticated expression, mind you, but a vocalization nevertheless, as if to protest, "Nay, good squire, you misinterpret. I speak not of the gustatory delights, but of the anatomical provenance of yon spheroid, namely, in the lower intestinal region of the animal, where may be found the admirable quality of fortitude, demonstrated as it is in the resilience of this object of play." Gronk 1, let's call him Hector for ease of reference, then responded with an of feigned acknowledgement. Gronk 2, similarly, let's call him Benson for the same reason, both of whom peer around in wonderment when their names are mentioned, then permits the object to drop according to the eminently dependable law of gravity, whereupon the deer's bladder orb, pneumatic as it is, bounces from the ground as he kicks it up to himself with a satisfied grin, signaling a sense of accomplishment. Let the viewer understand that this grin is indicative of an additional form of communication whereby alternately pursing lips, moving either or both corners of the mouth, raising eyebrows, flaring nostrils, and wiggling ears, all complete with inflection and emphasis, constitutes a system of facial signs now lost to history. Just as well, perhaps, we might intone, for it would prove impractical for, say, a baseball manager to utilize. Is he giving signs or just swatting away mosquitoes? Except, of course, for shrugging the shoulders, which is still with us today. The leader then takes the object in his hand reassuringly. Once again, Benson exclaims, as if to dissuade him and announce, On the contrary, my dear compatriot, the rules of the game as I have established them are such that they do not permit the handling of the object with, what else, the hands and arms. Notice, hands which handle, hence the derivation of the term. Never mind. Instead, only the other body parts are allowed to make contact with it. Looking inquisitively about, this prompts Hector to utter a guffaw as if to lament, "We possess perfectly good upper appendages which could be employed in the game." Astounding the detail these short grunts connote. Benson shakes his head as if to pontificate. "Even so, that would detract from the beauty of the sport," only much later to be called the beautiful game. Undeterred, Hector growls, grabs the object, tucks it firmly in his hand by his armpit, and extends the free arm straight outward as if to fend off would-be attackers, believing opponents would seek to dislodge the object from his control. Benson, who would not be prevailed upon, simply shakes his head as if to bemoan, "See here, that will never work. Who would engage in a sport like that?" Insistent upon the superiority of his idea, Hector motions to have Benson attempt to prevent Hector's progress in carrying the object. Benson is unwilling and holds up his hand as if to say, "Most appreciated, but I elect to pass." Hector redoubles his efforts to have Benson comply, subtly reminding him of the present rank differential, but he is firm in motioning, "No, really, I simply must protest that I would rather not." Yet Hector would neither cease nor desist, prompting Benson to imply by his facial expression to assert, "Very well, my fine friend, I shall take you up on your provocation and resist with all the means at my disposal, and I intend to reduce you to a whimpering moss." And with that, the video component of our tale turns black and the audio presents the noise of motor vehicles in collision with hubcaps sliding along the pavement. Curious metallic and asphalt sounds for the group, mired as they are deep in the bowels of the Stone Age. Once the light is restored, Benson is found atop Hector in a pick-a-back fashion, tongue firmly on the outside of his mouth and rubbing his knuckles on the top of Hector's head in an early ancestral form of noogies, entirely failing therewith to halt the advancement of the object carrier. Believing to have proven his point, Hector proceeds to metaphorically throw down the gauntlet, should he have been in possession of such an anachronistic item, and about which Benson could only shrug, and spikes the object in a fit of peevishness and challenges the latter to a team duel. Hector promises roundly to defeat him at his own game's devices to commence at 1:15 the following day, despite having insufficiently developed gestures with which to convey it. Somehow the intent is communicated and the challenge accepted. We wouldn't have much of a tale had he declined. Provided, of course, the domestic chores could be completed in timely fashion. He would need to check his schedule. The next day, see, the meaning did get across, Sunday for those keeping track, was suitably dry for a sporting event. Hector prepares his troops as a player coach would, instilling in them, even prior to the time that there was anyone identified as a gipper, that if opponents should come at them from the right, then they were to move left, and vice versa. To which the players roll their eyes as if to drone, "This is insipidly obvious. What else you got?" The first order of business is to set some ground rules. The length of the field is 100 steps, the members of the group all operating in base 10, owing to their 10 digits and toes. One works with what one has. The goal line at each end is 100 steps distant, where the object of play must cross for a goal to be counted, and is bordered by a skull on each side 8 steps apart, in direct defiance of 10 or multiples thereof. And should there be a penalty kick, it is to occur from the 11-step line, ditto. As for the duration of the contest, an official gronk indicates that a sundial will mark the beginning, to be alerted by the sounding of yet another skull struck by a bone. As explained to both sets of competitors, the next such sound will signify break time, communicated by the gesture of the head tilted and a cheek placed on the back of the hands, implying that one could sleep during this time if one so desires, and to which the teams gave an emphatic hurrah. Play will resume for an equal amount of time as the first, what would come to be known as a half, once the skull is struck again. The end of the match will be signaled by a final skull strike, at which point full time is reached and a winner declared. The players take to the field. In the end, each will defend. But before the game commences, a female, Gronk at 1, let's name her Tamsin, strolls out onto center field. The crowd gathered there stands at attention as she voices, naturally without words, though making an ah sound with each note, the first few bars of what would much later be known as the British hymn Jerusalem.
La 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 la. La 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 la.
Struck by the lofty intent of the piece, some remove their headgear, place them over their hearts, and are observed to have quivering lips, and during which time a player, let's call him Delbert, takes a knee as other sports figures of a later age and fretfully sniffs the air in protest of the hymn, lobbying as he does for Neanderthal rights and other equal treatment before the law and its enforcement authorities. Tamsin, the vocalist, then jogs off the field, waving to the crowd amid enthusiastic applause. Meanwhile, an impartial group member with a talent for whistling is brought in to ensure the rules of the game are followed. He perceives early on that two players, one of whom is Benson, are battling for ball possession as Benson pushes the other over and knocks him down. The impartial one immediately puts to use his whistling penchant and halts play, despite the shadow of the sundial moving relentlessly forward, and holds up a bone to signify that a major infraction has just transpired, much later to be understood as the objectionable conviction of being red-carded. The convict attempts to explain his version of events by pointing his index finger at the impartial one, being careful not to touch the one held in such high esteem, and uttering the sound BAP, signifying the meager amount of contact he dealt out onto his opponent, and follows this up by raising his hands, flailing them about, and, as later physicians would request, stick out your tongue and say ah, portrays the feeble nature of the offense and lack of sturdiness on the part of the player to withstand it, as if to say, "Be not fooled by the antics on his part with such a lame display, as though felled by little more than a twig, for his is but histrionics." Alas, the efforts were to no avail, and Benson is sent off the field, leaving his team one player short, the partisan segments of the crowd either voicing their disapproval or cheering in hearty agreement. As pertains to the crowd, all standing, which is why it's called In the Stands, yet another Gronk, let's name him Cedric, moves through it with a portable concession stand, a mobile refreshment unit, consisting of wooden cups on a wooden tray, held over the shoulder with a leather strap. Tasty drinks are on offer. Oi, oi! A spectator signals by raising his hand towards the vendor that he wishes to sample the wares. Cedric approaches and accepts from the spectator a stone in payment for the liquid refreshment. Cedric holds the stone up to the sky as though to examine it for possible evidences of counterfeiting. He soon recognizes that this examination proves inconclusive, given that the stone possesses neither transparent nor translucent qualities, and knocks it against the edge of his tray instead, trusting that this assesses it as legitimate, and returns 2 pebbles to the customer in change. He hands over the wooden cup, the man takes a swig, turns around and lets out a sizable belch, whereupon a woman he is with looks around in disgust and mumbles something inaudible about desiring to be rescued from the embarrassment. She looks about as perplexed as somebody attempting to remove a boundary stone telekinetically. While the action on the field is nearing its conclusion, what with the score still deadlocked at what would later be described variously and in alphabetical order as bagels, donuts, or lifesavers, the players seek for any possible edge. In an attempt to remedy the scoring drought, one player endeavors to apply his head to the difficulty, literally, and using it to deflect a pass toward the goal. The projectile orb trickles across the goal line, marking what would be the only goal of the contest. The proud scoring player then assumes an arms folded looking off into the distance pose and is flanked by 2 cheerleaders stroking his forearms and making an exclamatory "ooh" sound. They then notice the aforementioned Delbert on the sidelines, stereotypically kicking a spare object of play deftly upward with his feet and knees, never allowing it to touch the ground. In a fit of flavor of the month, flash in the pan, 15 minutes of fame, fickleness, one of them, as well as a different cheerleader, give an even greater cooing and fawning display. We each have our favorites. Sometimes our behaviors do have a long history. The shadow on the sundial advances ever nearer its endpoint, the crowd exhibiting increasing looks of anxiousness as it does so, and the scoring team wonders if it can survive a late barrage from the opposition. At last, the official sounds the skull, and the impartial one gives a last resounding whistle, signaling the conclusion is reached and bringing the contest to a close. Final score, 1-0, the latter concept essential for the higher mathematics of a future age. The prevailing side is jubilant, the losing side either despondent or disconsolate, whichever is worst. The crowd disperses, some to the glory of victory, others to the humiliation of defeat. Some group members, buoyed by the success of the event, approach the short black monolith in search of the inspiration for further novel occurrences. One fearless individual, Gronket 2, let's name her Pippa, touches the diminutive edifice and is immediately taken aback by the tactile encounter. A hush falls over the crowd as it turns around to witness what might transpire. The brave group member bends down to scrutinize an even more puny, minute, itty-bitty plate on the depository and dispenser of novelty and seeks to convert the symbols into sounds, thereby embarking on a journey leading to the onset of linguistics. Those gathered recognize that an unprecedented event is about to be generated. Initially, her lips move, but nothing audible emerges. She then sheds her inhibitions and lets loose with an unrefined vocalization. Out comes
me de in China. Made in China.
The crowd looks around at each other and runs off in frenzied terror, not knowing whether it fears eventual language exams or what is to befall humanity in terms of the source of nearly all manufactured consumer goods in the distant future, or both. A further development is such that this linguistic capacity becomes contagious. Not long after the first words are spoken, other group members engage in vigorous discussion using their newfound abilities about what the sport having recently been observed should be named. Humans becoming adept at naming animate entities and inanimate items in their environment. Some choose soccer, since the object of play designated a ball was socked in a kicking action, completely overlooking the fact that it could just as readily be called kickball. The others point to their lower extremities as the determining features of the name and refer to it as football. A chorus of song then breaks out as each promotes its term as the one to be assigned. Competing ideas about the object of play were committed to lyrics. It is a soccer ball versus, no, it is a football ball. Neither a musical masterpiece, but definitely melodic. They are found to have instrumental accompaniment in the way of a beat supplied by those energetically striking skulls with a bone. These three forming a group known as the Chosen Few, singing their copyright hit tune, "You Can't Roller Skate on Natural Turf, but if we were to, do we keep to the right or left?" Good tune. Concurrently, and surfacing entirely outside the bounds of physical law, a film crew arrives to capture the event. Some group members become amused when they perceive artificial lights employed for the production, even in broad daylight. Inexplicably, this overshadows the very astonishment their arrival elicits. The person in front of the box with a dark interior, named a camera, seeks an interview with Benson and comments, "Sounds like you've got a real controversy on your hands about reaching a decision concerning the name of this sport." Benson looks at his hands to determine if something is literally attached to them and concludes it's merely a figure of speech. The interviewer speaks into a snow cone or lollipop, for lack of a better term, and points the business end of this, let's call the small receiver recording device a microphone, into the interviewee's face, quite rudely invading Benson's imaginary space. Startled by the strange individual, in a flurry of verbal activity and not always certain as to what he was saying, Benson chimes in with, "Well, that's right, Biff. This is a debate that will no doubt rage for over 50,000 years. Wait, how did I know that? Contrary to this euphoria, Hector nurses a grudge about the popularity of the sport in competition with his, and which he regards as inferior to his own and thinks, "A pox on your blasted contrivance, committed to the flames." He thus seeks the assistance of the mini-monolith for injurious purposes. He does so moved by the realization that inspiration can also operate in a nefarious fashion, and intends to apply his newfound powers not for pleasantness but for selfness. He locates a stick with a sharp end and elects to introduce that end to the surface of the soccer football ball so as to puncture it. It works. Mission accomplished. Gleeful about the damage he inflicts, and consequently ushering a dark period in human history, our tale ends with his jumping in the air in response and clicking his heels over his detrimental achievement, preserved in perpetuity through the film crew's technological miracle of freeze frame. Well, you can't roller skate on natural turf, though it would be worse in a place with surf. But if you do, you gotta stay in your lane, 'cause if you don't, you might not remain. By right, I mean correct, and not right and left as you might suspect. 'Cause if you fall, you might get some scrapes, and that's one thing you wanna escape. Any kind of bone can break clean through, causing pain, and that's a fine how'd you do. Should you have a mishap, then what do? It's not private property, so who do you sue? And you can't take your case to a court of law, 'cause we ain't got none as far as I saw. And complaining's not a way to win any friends, 'cause you don't want to go solo in the end. They say Neanderthals ain't got no beat, but our rhythm cred comes from our street. Now I don't mind my kin and all that, but to be a sapien is where it's at. Uh-huh.